They say that when God was resting on the seventh day, he looked around him and found a handful of uncut jewels that he hadn't used. And so, not wanting to labor too much on the Sabbath day, he just opened a window in heaven and threw the jewels out. And they fell in a long, unstrung string off the northwest coast of Scotland, and formed what men came to know as the Outer Hebrides. Then, after the flood, when the dove found Mount Ararat, the seagull it was that found the Hebrides, and the sanderlings and the turnstones followed. Likewise, the early Celts, in search of new lands, pushed west and further west, till the Atlantic stopped them on the tangled, rocky shore of Uist. They built their memorials, those early people, in the bleak country pounded by the breakers out of the oldest rock in the world. Pounded into sand, which in its turn made an uneasy marriage with peat to form a belt of arable land round the coast. In Gaelic, we call it Macher. Gradually, homesteads built up in clusters, their sites decided by conditions for living and defense. Invaders came hopefully and left disappointed. Even the Vikings who ravaged Uist left little mark. Of the three townships which fringe this most westerly promontory of North Uist, only Hoigari takes its name from the Norse. The other two, Tayari and Balranald, are Gaelic. The old clan system was destroyed with Prince Charlie, and the land of the chief of Clanranald here in Uist was broken up and sold as sporting and sheep estates. The clansmen who weren't evicted were allowed to squeeze livings out of coastal patches and wild seas. Crofters, they call us now. We have clung on. Our traditions have been eroded by the media and mainland influences, but Gaelic is still the language of our family life and of our church. This is a typical croft. By law, it is now secure to the crofter and his heirs for a small rent of only a few pounds a year. It's really a miniature farm, too small to provide a comfortable living without another job, too tiny for mechanization. Communal effort has to make do for sophisticated machinery, and without cooperation, the crofting life would be impossible. Everybody helps everybody else. Today, we're with Callum MacDonald, and tomorrow we'll be with somebody else. Neil MacDonald of Hoigari gives a helping hand to Donald John MacDonald of Balranald, and the chances are that, given a good dry day tomorrow, we'll all be with Angus. As well as his croft, Angus runs the post office, quietly tailoring the one job to the other, perhaps, because in this kind of community it may sometimes be more urgent to thresh the corn than it is to stamp the mail. The post office may be run by the clock, but season and weather, dawn and dusk alone can govern the work of the croft. Communal effort ensures that the infirm are never forgotten and that the widow gets her share. The Atlantic waves which burst on the North Uist shores have rolled in countless miles from America. and their groundswell has uprooted the seaweed from the ocean floor. This is his share for the purple sandpiper, nature's provision of food among the tangled. The sandpipers winter here before following the sanderlings and the turnstones north to the Arctic. Like the birds, the Uist man accepts the sea's bounty and uses it in the way which nature surely intended, to be ploughed back into the earth again to feed the sandy Mallard and the crops we grow there. Our old songs say that the land and the sea are reluctant partners in a marriage, as the potato and the herring are reluctant bedmates on a plate. Certainly, we believe that a Mallard-grown potato has a taste of its own. But even more certainly, there would be no Mallard for man or beast if generations of Uist men hadn't fed it with seaweed from the shore. In the old days, we carried it in creels on our backs, but the tractor has taken that agony off us. And certainly it took a lot of agony to win the Mallard from the sea in the first place. At first, the sand is loose and easily wind-blown, and nothing will grow in it except the murran, as we call it in Gaelic, the marram grass, as the English would have it. It's a coarse, springy stuff, and as it grows, its roots intertwine tightly, and it binds the sand and holds it firm. The seaward face of the sand dunes may be blown by westerly gales, but the Mallard land is protected in the lee of the marram belt. Over generations, the Uist men have practiced an elementary form of land reclamation by encouraging the marram to hold the front. Bound by the marram roots and fed with copious dressings of seaweed from the shore, the Mallard can be encouraged to grow luxuriously and to be strengthened sufficiently for the plough. In the winter and early spring, the Mallard is bare and has little to offer in the way of food for beast or bird. But the whooper swan has learnt a thing or two. It knows that this is the time against which the crofters made provision in the autumn, and that it's essential for them to feed their cattle and their sheep through the lean, cold months. Recently, the swans have learnt that the land rover will appear regularly with loads of corn, and with crofters like Angus John McClellan to dispense it. The whooper swans come to us in October, when we're feeding the cattle, and the Mallard has nothing to offer either. They work a daily routine, which they do as if they knew our every move. In the mornings, they come and eat with the cattle, and when they've had their fill, they go off and rest in the marshes till the feeding time for the cows comes round again. Our croftland surrounds what was once an arm of the sea, but it's now a huge stretch of marsh, the Gullar Marsh. It's probably a Viking name. There's nothing like it in the whole of the Western Isles for size. The older crofters remember when the shoveler was here, as well as a much larger variety of duck, and he still mates here, but in fewer numbers now. The same applies to many birds, and it's probably because of our subsidized drainage schemes that the character of the marsh has changed over the years, and therefore the supply of the right food is diminishing or altering in quality. The little grebe is not as plentiful as he used to be, and the phalarope doesn't breed here anymore. Not so the redshank, who, along with all the rest, now enjoys the safety of Gullar and can pursue his courtship unmolested. It was in 1966 that the crofters of Hoigari, Tayari and MacDonald agreed to a nature reserve being set up by the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. We thought it a bit of a daft idea at first, but there was no obvious harm in it. To them who had grown up among them, birds were just birds, except for the ones that were good to eat. We didn't eat the redshank, or the peary as we call him, because he was too wee to be bothered with, and in any case, he's supposed to have a salty, bitter taste. Ducks like the mallard were a different matter. Today, however, on Gullar, the mallard is allowed to multiply in peace. While the water birds have been in decline in North Uist, not because the crofters were eating them all, but because the marshes were being drained, birds like the lapwing continue to flourish unharmed and unmolested. The lapwing, the buntings, the finches and the pied wagtails will thrive in Uist, we're told, so long as the crofter continues his traditional form of agriculture and doesn't go over too much to chemicals. The trouble is that the more educated you become, the more you tend to go in for things of that kind. And education, which we respect next to religion itself in this part of the world, we have found to be a blessing with a shadowy side to it. Young men like Alistair MacDonald here are taught from childhood that book learning is an essential part of their lives, and of course it is. But the trouble is that higher education means leaving the island for the colleges and universities of the cities, and a great many of those who go don't come back. The result is that here we tend to have an aging population by and large. There is a saying in this part of the world that when God made time, he made plenty of it. But the crofter's time was never taken up with bird watching, but he did note them in his songs, his proverbs, and his sayings. You're as tricky as a peeweet, they used to say, obviously because of the peeweet's habit of doing everything imaginable to trick an intruder away from her nest. As a boy, I remember the exasperation of it myself, till I learnt that wherever the peeweet was showing most excitement was where her chick was not. But now I'm told there's more to it than that. They tell me that when the peeweet is carrying on like this, she's really declaring her rights to her own territory, much the same as the crofters over the years fought for the security of their tenure. There is one bird who is firmly entrenched as part of our island life, not least because of his unfailing art of making himself heard, the corncrake. One first becomes aware of him in the spring, during the ploughing and the sowing, when an occasional one makes himself heard, as rare as the cuckoo at first. Occasionally, one can catch a glimpse of one scuttering and scuttling here and there between the wild iris patches. As the summer comes in, they become impossible. They hawk and croak all evening like the rattles at a football match, as long as there's a glisk of daylight. And here in Uist, the summer evenings are very long. Many a man they've driven out of his mind as he tried to get a sleep after a good day's work or a good night's dram. Annoying it may be, but it's the corncrake's keep-off call to intruders of his own kind. Nowadays, the crofters get good subsidies and grants to enable them to reseed and reclaim the moorland and turn it into useful grazing. This has encouraged the corncrake to move in here too. But certainly the better grassland has tempted the red deer to move in, but they are the inviolate property of the landlord, and the gamekeeper has to be called to chase them off our new grass. The crofter isn't allowed to shoot them officially. The reclaiming of the moorland has had a fairly dramatic effect on the crofters' incomes. Now they're able to keep more cattle because they thrive on the luscious, regenerated land. Practically every crofter keeps a beast or two, which he feeds over the winter and sells at the spring sales. People like Donald John MacDonald have developed a certain skill with stock. He always has a fair number of fat beasts at the sales and usually commands fat prices. The cattle are auctioned at Clachan, which is 7 miles from Hoygerry. It's a long trek for those who can't take advantage of the van. Most of the beasts go to mainland buyers who can fatten them further on better grazing than island crofters have, and then resell them at huge sales in the lowlands. A good stirk can sell for 150 to 200 pounds, and even at that, prices are considerably lower than they are elsewhere in Scotland, because the buyers have to allow for the heavy freight charges they have to pay to get the beasts across the waters of the Minch.
You should have. Why? You don't see it in the Hector again? No. Hector's quiet, so we don't. You, MacDonald?
No crofter can hope to concentrate exclusively on cattle breeding because he just hasn't got the land as a general rule. A 10-acre croft on its own just isn't enough. Perhaps the planner's answer might be to weld many crofts into large farm units, all of which conjures up a picture of a Uist of the future, populated by a few prosperous farmers, surrounded by myriads of protected birds.
180, 180, 190, 190, 120, 120, 122, 122, 123, 124, 125, 125, 126, 127, 127, 128, 129, 129,
The lonely lochs of the bleak Uist moorland are undisturbed year in, year out. The lerach, the black-throated diver, nests here in solitude. We know that because a few fishermen have seen him and left him alone with his desolate beauty. The moorland holds hidden assets for the crofter. On Wangish Hill, we still cut peat for winter fuel as the Uist men have done for centuries. The black, mushy peat which was formed by the decaying of primeval scrubland thousands of years ago. It's back-breaking work, particularly for the man who's throwing. But here is one island activity which shows less and less sign of decline as the cost of coal goes up. In 3 days, 2 men can cut a winter's supply, but it takes weeks of good drying weather to make it fit for burning, with that bitter-sweet smell which haunts most Hebridean villages. Under the heather and the moss, there are millions of tons of it. It costs a token annual fee and a man's sweat and labor. The oldest form of moorland reclamation is heather burning, a carefully controlled operation which the crofters can practice up till the end of April and the birds' nesting time. The burning makes it possible for a reasonable quantity of grass to come up for a year or two till the heather reasserts itself and chokes it off again. For the hill sheep, the process is vital. The landlord's factor keeps a careful eye on the moor fires because a heather blaze can spread very quickly and cause infinite damage. It's impossible for the crofter to herd his sheep adequately once they've been taken off the macher grazing and put onto the moorland for the summer. So inevitably, the loss of sheep stock is much higher than it is when sheep are intensively farmed on the mainland under the eye of a professional shepherd. We have our crofts to attend to, miles away from the high grazing, and it's sometimes difficult to spot the odd case of fluke or braxy in time. If a sheep gets into trouble in a bog or a ditch, it's spotted all right, by the detested hoodie crow or black-backed gull. Both are scavengers, and it would seem to us that they're never very fussy as to whether the animal is alive or not. Scientific research has shown that the hoodies and the blackbacks are mainly carrion eaters, but we take a lot of convincing as we see them keeping watch when a sheep is having a difficult birth or is having trouble getting off its back. And there are plenty of one-eyed sheep around to bear testimony to narrow escapes. There are few sights more awesome than the lone eagle soaring in the emptiness of the Hebridean sky, her eye sharp enough to spot the movement of a baby rabbit 1,000 feet below. The golden eagle is part of our Gallic legend and mythology. It's the subject of our songs and emblem of our heroes. Maybe it's because we're a religious people in these parts that we sing of the eagle as a proud man's soul soaring heavenwards. It's part of our own fantasy, probably, because I doubt if golden eagles existed where the first great shepherd first wrote the Psalms. But if they did, and if the translation is true, David had fewer doubts in his mind than the Uist crofter has. For there are those of us who suspect that the eagle can be an occasional killer of lambs, although the experts assure us that their studies of eyries prove that the eagles are carrion eaters, but mainly hunt rabbits and hares and grouse and ptarmigan. Good luck to him with the grouse. In these parts they're the landlord's anyway, and no crofter begrudges a good poacher one for his pot. Anyway, whatever the eagle's faults or the crofter's views, the shepherd can only herd his flock down below, knowing that the eagle, heroine of his folklore, can watch every move of his lambs and himself, secure not only in the height and isolation of her eyrie, but also safe behind the majesty of the law. Up in the mountain crags, with her own long view and her own speed and strength to protect her, the golden eagle can afford to enjoy her meal in peace, while her friends and enemies debate her menu. Poetic justice, for in our own classic Gallic tale, The Battle of the Beasts, it was the eagle that we made into the umpire, because her towering height and breadth of vision let her see everything. There are few lovelier sights than the Macher in summer, when it's matted with flowers, daisies, buttercups, pansies, and hundreds more. These are the fallow parts used for grazing the cattle during the short summer nights and long days. Small shorebirds, like the dunlin, often nest in the hoof marks left by the cows, and when the eggs hatch, the parents are in a frenzy trying to herd the chicks away from the trampling hooves of the beasts. They have plenty of time, for there are few things in life more leisurely than a grazing Uist cow. A summer day on the Mallard is one of the many things that the islander, forced to live in the city, remembers and hopes to come back to. Many of them never do till they're carried back at the end. Many islanders take out special insurance policies to guarantee that they're laid to rest in the soil of their homeland when the time comes. In the Hebrides, the kirkyards are usually in sight of the sea. Some days of summer are a fisherman's dream. A calm sea, no wind. It allows them to make passage to the more distant grounds. The fishermen are becoming more prosperous now with the coming of bigger boats. For the cormorant and the shag, distance is less of a problem. Gannet, too, was built for the two Alisters under the Highlands and Islands Development Board scheme for the revitalizing of lobster fishing. Modern echo-sounders can help in the search for lobster reefs. No modern echo-sounder is required by the restless, questing gannet. Lobster fishing is the crofter's main industry in summer. The croft comes second. Lobster fishing is a slow, rough, and tiring process. The men are at sea from dawn to dusk. It can be dangerous, too, in these boats, and it's only the high price of lobster that makes it worthwhile. The best lobsters are to be found in the rocky outcrops around the islands and the skerries, and even on a fine day, the swell can make the boatman's life difficult and hazardous. He has to learn to tune himself to the rhythm of the swell. Every seventh wave was a wave of healing in old Highland lore. To the lobster fisherman, it's the strong pull of danger. Fishermen everywhere are men of superstition. Our islanders have their own. Although crottle, the lichen from the rocks, is the most popular dye, providing rich brown wool, the Uist fishermen will never wear crottle-dyed clothes because they say crottle always returns to the rocks. In his own world, the strong-chested fulmar has been bred and distilled almost to put the swells and eddies of his own world to best advantage. Maybe because of this, or maybe because of controlled inshore fishing, the fulmar colonies have been growing and spreading in recent years, and we've noticed that in recent years, too, they're tending to colonize crags nearer the crofts. He does us no harm, and a man with time to watch can only admire his gracefulness. The old men used to say that the autumn came with the grey-lag goose and not with the calendar, and that thousands of miles away the geese could tell exactly when the corn would be ripe in Uist. But whether or not the visitors arrive for the harvest, our own grey-lags are always with us, for the harvest and the garnering which follows. The wheat-ear is of another mind. He is only here in the passing. Winter in Uist is not for him and he prepares to set off in chase of the sun on other Machar lands. The harvest here begins much later than on the mainland, and indeed often enough the crofters are still building stooks of corn in mid-October. Their growing plots are not all in the one place, and sometimes they have to wait several days for a neighbour to cut his first swathe before they can make a start. These delays can cause a bit of bad feeling, particularly if people get the impression that they're losing days of good drying weather because of someone else's tardiness. Fine days and good drying winds are priceless gifts in autumn. The harvest is a fat time for the birds, and they make the most of it. It was about a thieving field mouse that the mainland bard Robert Burns said, "A dame nicker in a thrave's a small request, so what's a grain of barley for a Uist bird?" It's an urgent and busy time for the crofters. A really bad harvest can be disaster anywhere, but doubly so on Uist. Failure means that winter feed has to be imported from the mainland, and that is why on a day like this, Alistair is glad of the extra help from his young brother Donald, who has now finished school, and like so many of our boys nowadays, hasn't been able to find a job yet. When Lachlan MacDonald left school, it was to go to sea in his father's boat, even although by today's thinking he was too young at 14 for the heavy work involved with oar and sail. He remembers some rough days when they went seal hunting to Cashmel and Jeasker, rocky little islands which were anything but sanctuaries for seals then. All-a-rawn, or seal oil, was a specific for colds and flus, and it was fed to the young children during the winter. It was fed to the cattle, too, to supplement their vitamin diet, although, of course, there wasn't even a Gaelic word for vitamin in Uist in those days. It was Lachlan Alec's job to jump ashore and knock the seal pups on their head for the blubber. We don't go hunting seals in Uist anymore, though there is a lucrative sealskin industry in some of the other islands. Perhaps we Uist men have a softer side for the seals. After all, we created the legend that the seals are princes and princesses of Norway under spells, and that some of us are descended from a few who managed to regain their human form. It's a good story for a cold winter's night. Lachlan Alec MacDonald relives old memories. Autumn, they say, is a time for old men's dreams. Winter, a time for nightmares. Today, the old men of Uist have their fears for the island's future, and the worst of them is that the island may be fated to be a nuclear dumping ground. There are only 155 people left in this beautiful but thankless land, and it's easier to dwell on the past than see into the future. The crofting population can't increase because the land can't support anymore. The young men can't leave for employment elsewhere because employment isn't there. The nightmare is already with them. There are no tides that have no turnings. And here, where we know man's days to be shorter than memory, we watch the slow return to nature's balance. And who knows, the birds were here before us, and may be here long after the lights men lit are out.